Hello, it's Alister McGrath again, talking to you about my textbook, Christian Theology, an Introduction. We now come to the 14th chapter, and in this chapter we develop a theme that was implicit in our discussion of salvation, namely the question of human nature, and particularly what it is about humanity that makes redemption necessary in the first place. As well as exploring a theological understanding of human nature, this chapter also explores the nature of divine grace, and especially the way in which Christian theology has understood the interplay between God's grace on the one hand and human freedom on the other. So the chapter opens by looking at the notions of fallenness and sin, and how these have shaped Christian thinking about human nature, and particularly the limitations that are placed upon it. Yeah, I think I need to emphasize that there's a lot more to the Christian understanding of human nature than the idea of sin. And this chapter sets out the Christian understanding of human nature as created by God, looking particularly at the idea of being made in the image of God. What does that mean? Now, a particularly important debate on the interplay of human nature and divine grace took place in the early 5th century, and this involved the British theologian Pelagius and Augustine of Hippo. And this chapter gives a detailed account of this controversy, the Pelagian controversy, and explores its wider implications for understanding both human nature and the grace of God. Augustine's reflections on the human situation and divine grace were developed further during the Middle Ages. Now remember, this was a period of theological systematization. And medieval writers found that Augustine's rather simple notion of grace needed expansion. It needed to cope with some new theological questions that had arisen. And Augustine's theological legacy shaped the great religious debates of the 16th century Reformation as well. It looks as if everyone at that time wanted to show their Augustinian credentials. Now, Protestant reformers such as Martin Luther and John Calvin focused on the idea of justification by faith. And at times they were critical of Augustine, particularly in relation to his transformative understanding of grace. And in this chapter, we look at the Reformation debates over justification in some detail, noting, of course, their importance for ecumenical debates today, but also for the historic development of both Protestantism and Catholicism. And a point of particular importance is to try and clarify just what the differences were between Catholics and Protestants at this time. But the doctrine of grace is about more than justification. It also includes the idea of election and predestination. And although these ideas are developed in the writings of Augustine, they were given particularly forceful statement in the writings of John Calvin and his successors within the Reformed tradition. And these ideas are explored carefully, both as theological doctrines, but also as cultural influences. Because the German sociologist Max Weber argued that Calvin's doctrine of predestination was actually a major stimulus to the development of modern capitalism. But we also look at other questions in this chapter. One of them, of course, is how theological understandings of human nature relate to contemporary biological debates about human origins and development. And in this chapter, we look at 4 quite different approaches to these questions and begin to explore their assessment. And again, the idea is to say, here are what people have thought. What do you think? It's about resourcing your own intellectual development. So that's a very brief overview of this chapter. So let's now explore it in a lot more detail. The chapter opens by looking at early Christian understandings of the place of humanity within creation. And the 2 major elements of this understanding are the concept of the image of God and sin. Again, the image of God and sin. And Genesis 1:27 talks about humanity being made in God's image and likeness, an idea which is often expressed with reference to the Latin phrase imago Dei, the image of God. So what does it mean to say that humanity bears God's image? The belief that humanity is made in God's image or bears the image of God was considered by patristic writers to affirm the original uprightness and dignity of human nature. Humanity was created with integrity, but something has gone wrong with us. This doesn't mean that we've lost the image of God or that it's been deleted. For most patristic writers, it's something that can be recovered because it's been damaged or it's been, if you like, distorted. But the image of God, it's argued within humanity, may be damaged, but it can be restored. Now, the idea of sin plays an important role in early Christian reflection on the nature and necessity of salvation. So, how do we understand the idea of sin? Is sin an act of disobedience, or is it a state of disobedience? And if so, how does this relate to the biblical creation accounts of humanity? And in this chapter, I draw on the Oxford patristic scholar J.N.D. Kelly, who notes various ways in which the Eastern Christian tradition in particular saw humanity as being involved in some way in the disobedience of Adam. In the Western tradition, the idea of original sin received an important stimulus to the writings of Augustine of Hippo, often in response to the Pelagian debates of the early 5th century. For Augustine, humanity is universally affected by sin as a result of the fall. It's not something that, in effect, happens to us as we grow up. It's something that's inbuilt within us right from the word go. And Augustine argues that the human mind has become darkened and the human will has become weakened by sin. Humanity, for Augustine, is born with a sinful disposition, almost like some kind of congenital disease. Sin thus causes sins. The underlying state of sinfulness causes individual acts of sin. We need to heal the condition if we're going to do something about sinful actions. Now, Augustine's opponent in this controversy, Pelagius, had no place for any idea of a human disposition towards sin. Sin, for Pelagius, is something that we do willfully against God. It is always possible for humans to discharge their obligations towards God and their neighbours, and failure to do so is inexcusable. And to its critics, Pelagianism seems like some kind of moral authoritarianism, an insistence that humanity is under an obligation to be sinless, and an absolute rejection of any excuse for failure. Now, in this chapter, we look at this Pelagian controversy in some detail, looking at its ideas on human freedom, human sin, divine grace, and the basis of salvation. And the reason that we spend so much time looking at this controversy is that these issues recur. There are many ages of Christian theology which often look like a replay of the Pelagian controversy. Indeed, many Reformation writers see their own period of history as actively replaying the Pelagian controversy. So the Pelagian controversy is a very important point of reference for those discussions. Now, you'll remember that in the second chapter of the textbook, I highlight the importance of the Middle Ages as a period of theological systematization. And this is especially evident in the case of the doctrine of grace. Because medieval theologians wanted to preserve, to affirm what Augustine said about grace, but found that the terms he used weren't actually all that helpful. And they came to the conclusion that Augustine's ideas about grace needed to be clarified and expanded. Now, theologians of the early Middle Ages were generally content to regard grace as a kind of theological shorthand for the graciousness or the liberality of God. But as the Middle Ages proceeded, there was pressure for theological systematization, leading to the development of an increasingly precise vocabulary of grace. And although Thomas Aquinas, writing in the 13th century, treats Augustine's analysis of grace with considerable respect, he felt the need to introduce a distinction which was not there in Augustine between actual grace and habitual grace. So, what does Aquinas mean by this distinction? Well, actual grace refers to a series of divine actions or influences upon human nature, whereas habitual grace means a created habit of grace within the human soul. So it's a distinction between God's action without us and God's presence within us. For Aquinas, God cannot establish a direct presence of God within human nature. An intermediate stage is required in which the human soul is made ready for the habitation of God. And the idea of habitual grace refers to a permanent change in the human soul. Aquinas refers to this as something that's supernatural within the soul. Now, this idea of habitual grace became the subject of considerable criticism in the later Middle Ages. For example, during the 14th century, William of Ockham used his famous razor to eliminate what he regarded as unnecessary hypotheses from every area of theology. Ockham's razor is basically about shaving away things that seem to be unnecessary, including, for Ockham, the idea of a created habit of grace. Why do we need that idea? For Ockham, God was perfectly capable of accepting a sinner directly, without the need for any intermediary at all. And as we'll see, this basic idea is reiterated in the theologies of grace of the Protestant Reformation. So we come to the Reformation debates about the doctrine of grace. And one of the things I want you to notice is that these involved a significant change of vocabulary that seems to have taken place during the first half of the 16th century. Earlier Christian theologians, like Augustine, had given priority to New Testament texts that used the language of salvation by grace. Again, salvation by grace. However, Luther's wrestling with the issue of how God was able to accept sinners led him to focus on Pauline passages talking about justification by faith. And this terminology of justification by faith became normative for the great debates of the 16th century. And the doctrine of justification now came to be seen as dealing with the question of what an individual had to do in order to be saved. And as contemporary sources make very clear, this question came to be asked with increasing frequency in the early 16th century, possibly because of a growing interest in human subjectivity and individuality. And in the wake of this dawn of a new emphasis on individual consciousness or subjectivity came a new interest in the doctrine of justification, the question of how human beings as individuals could enter into a relationship with God. This question lay at the heart of the theological concerns of Martin Luther and eventually came to dominate the theological horizons of the Reformation as a whole. Luther held that the gospel condemned sinners, whereas the gospel, grounded in the death of Christ, offered them acceptance and liberation and hope in the face of death. Now, Luther chose to focus his thoughts about grace, redemption, and transformation on this issue of justification by faith alone. So after looking at Luther, we move on to look at the theologies of justification of leading Protestant thinkers of the 16th century, including, for example, John Calvin, trying to identify their basic features and also how these might represent a departure from or a development of the earlier theological tradition. And one of the most important changes concerns what the word justification means. Augustine used that word a lot, as did the Middle Ages, but justification was understood to be about making someone righteous. In other words, it designated a process of transformation. But Calvin and others made a distinction between justification and sanctification. Justification is the act of acceptance of someone by God, in which the believer is reckoned as righteous, whereas sanctification is the ensuing process of transformation, in which the believer is made righteous. And this way of thinking about justification is often described as forensic. It's about a legal pronouncement or judgment, not a personal transformation. Now, this forensic view of justification was strongly opposed by the Council of Trent, which set out the Catholic alternative to Luther's ideas. And for Trent, justification is about the process of regeneration and renewal within human nature, which brings about a change in both the outer status and the inner nature of the sinner. In effect, Trent used the term justification to mean more or less what Protestants understood by justification and sanctification combined. So I want you to notice that the two sides of this Reformation debate thus used the same central theological term, justification, but they understood that term in quite different ways. And you can see how this could easily lead to misunderstanding or miscommunication. But this chapter also considers other aspects of the doctrine of grace, including the very important Protestant debate about predestination, which involved Calvinists and Arminianism, and also the Catholic schools of thought that emerged in the era following the Council of Trent, such as Thomism, Molinism, and Jansenism. And we also pick up on this theme I noted earlier, the question of whether Calvin's theology of predestination has some connection with the emergence of capitalism. And this is the idea developed by the German sociologist Max Weber, and it's usually known as the Weber thesis. Finally, the chapter returns to the question of human nature and reflects on how Darwin's theory of human evolution plays into theological reflections on the significance of humanity. And this final section looks at four broad approaches you will find in contemporary theological discussion: old earth creationism, young earth creationism, intelligent design, and evolutionary theism. Now, these are very broad brush categories, and you'll find that really they're not adequate for describing the approaches that are taken, but nevertheless it's useful to use this framework to try and identify the options open. And debates about the impact of Darwin's theory of evolution on our understanding of human nature have been particularly significant in the United States of America. And so this closing section tries to identify the schools of thought and offer an assessment of their theological significance. So as you can see, this chapter covers a lot of ground, and I hope you'll enjoy it. Thank you so much for listening, and I look forward to speaking to you again very soon when I'll begin to reflect on the theology of the church, ecclesiology, which is discussed in chapter 15 of Christian Theology, an Introduction. Thank you so much for listening.